The harbormaster's log for September 17, 1904, records the arrival of the fishing schooner Margaret Rose at Gloucester, Massachusetts at 4:32 in the afternoon. The vessel carried a crew of 1. It should have carried 7. Arthur Henley, 28 years old, stood at the wheel when the harbormaster boarded. His hands, witnesses noted, were wrapped in strips of canvas stained dark, with what might have been blood or rust or something in between. He had been at sea for 11 days. The Margaret Rose showed no signs of storm damage. Her nets were intact. The hold contained approximately 200 pounds of salted cod. The harbormaster asked where the others were. Henley is recorded to have looked at him for a long moment before answering, "Gone." That single word would constitute nearly the entirety of his testimony regarding the events of September 6th through 16th, 1904. Dr. Samuel Wickham examined Henley at the county physician's office that evening. His notes, preserved in the Essex County Archives, describe a man of average height and build, approximately 140 pounds, showing signs of dehydration and exposure, but no major injuries. There were rope burns on both palms, bruising across the left shoulder and ribcage, consistent with impact against a hard surface. The wrapped hands concealed deep lacerations across the fingers of both hands, as though he had gripped something with desperate force for an extended period. Dr. Wickham wrote, "Subject responds to questions regarding physical ailments, but falls silent when asked about the voyage. Not defiant, not evasive, simply absent, as though the questions exist in a language he no longer speaks." The missing men were documented by the harbormaster within hours. Thomas Brennan, 41, married with 4 children, 15 years experience. James Coughlin, 37, bachelor, 12 years at sea. Peter Anderson, 52, widower, 28 years experience. Michael Brennan, 19, Thomas's eldest son, first major voyage. Daniel Kearney, 24, engaged to be married in October. Robert Ames, 33, married, 2 children. 6 families waited at the docks that evening. By nightfall, only 1 man had returned to them, and he would not meet their eyes. The Coast Guard inquiry opened the following morning in a cramped office overlooking the harbour. Captain Harold Vinson presiding. Henley sat across the desk, still wearing the same canvas work clothes from the voyage. Someone had brought him coffee. It sat untouched. The transcript runs to 47 pages. Henley's contributions account for fewer than 3. Captain Vinson: "Mr. Henley, for the record, please state your position aboard the Margaret Rose." Arthur Henley: "Crew, regular hand." Captain Vinson: "And the vessel departed Gloucester on what date?" Arthur Henley: "September 6th, morning tide." Captain Vinson: "Destination?" Arthur Henley: "George Bank, the usual grounds." Captain Vinson: "The weather that day?" Arthur Henley: "Clear." Captain Vinson: "Mr. Henley, we need to understand what happened to 6 men, 6 of your crewmates. Can you describe the events leading to their disappearance?" The transcript notes here, long pause, subject does not respond. Captain Vinson: "Mr. Henley?" Arthur Henley: "I can't." Captain Vinson: "Cannot or will not." Arthur Henley: "Can't." The distinction, Captain Vinson would later tell a reporter from the Gloucester Daily Times, seemed important to Henley. He did not say he would not speak. He said he could not, as though the words themselves had become physically impossible. By the 3rd day of inquiry, the questions had grown sharper. Captain Vinson: "Did the vessel encounter a storm?" Arthur Henley: "No." Captain Vinson: "Equipment failure?" Arthur Henley: "No." Captain Vinson: "Did you witness the men go overboard?" No response. Captain Vinson: "Mr. Henley, did someone aboard that vessel harm the others?" Arthur Henley: "No." Captain Vinson: "Then what in God's name happened?" Subject stares at hands. No response for approximately 2 minutes. Captain Vinson repeats the question. No response. Inquiry adjourned. The Margaret Rose was impounded and examined by marine surveyors. Their report, filed September 23, 1904, found the vessel seaworthy. No structural damage, no signs of violence aboard. The ship's log had been maintained through September 11th, 5 days after departure. The entries were routine: weather conditions, position, Catch tallies. The handwriting was Thomas Brennan's. On September 12th, the log went silent. In the galley, surveyors found food stores largely untouched. 6 hammocks below deck showed no signs of recent use. One hammock, Henley's based on positioning, contained a wool blanket and a rosary that had belonged to Peter Anderson. The most peculiar finding concerned the ship's compass. It had been removed from its standard mounting and placed in a canvas sack, wrapped carefully and stored in the captain's quarters. No explanation was offered in any available documentation for why this would be done. Margaret Brennan, widow of Thomas, attended every day of the inquiry. She sat in the back row of the gallery, her 4 children beside her. On the 4th day, she approached Henley as he left the building. A witness to the encounter, Clerk Martin Hayes, later described it to investigators. Mrs. Brennan didn't shout, didn't weep. She simply stood in his path and said, "My husband thought well of you, Arthur. He spoke of you kindly." Henley stopped walking. I thought he might speak then. His mouth opened, but nothing came. Mrs. Brennan waited. Then she said, "I need to know if he suffered." Henley closed his eyes. When he opened them, he looked at her directly for the first time. He said, "No, just that." Then he walked away. It was the last question he would answer about the voyage. The inquiry concluded on September 29, 1904, with a finding of unknown circumstances resulting in the loss of 6 crew members. No criminal charges were filed. Arthur Henley was released without restriction. He left the courthouse at 4:30 in the afternoon. According to the testimony of harbor workers, he walked directly to the docks, stood for some time looking at the Margaret Rose where it remained impounded, then turned and walked north along the waterfront. He did not return to his boarding house. His belongings were collected by the landlord 2 weeks later and stored in a trunk that was never claimed. The last confirmed sighting of Arthur Henley in Gloucester came from a railway porter at the Boston and Maine station. The porter, interviewed in 1921 as part of a retrospective investigation by a maritime historian, recalled a man matching Henley's description purchasing a ticket to Portland, Maine, on the evening of September 29th. The porter remembered because the man had stood at the platform for 20 minutes before the train departed, staring back toward the harbor, and had boarded only when the conductor called the final warning. He had the look, the porter said, of a man leaving something behind that he could never go back for. Arthur Henley was born in Rockport, Massachusetts in 1876, the second son of a quarry worker who died of silicosis when Arthur was 11. His mother, Ellen Henley, took in laundry. An older brother, William, worked the quarries until he lost 3 fingers to a cutting accident and moved west, eventually settling in Cleveland. There were letters between the brothers through 1903. They stopped after the voyage. School records show Arthur attended public school through the 6th grade before leaving to work. For 2 years he hauled granite blocks at the Rockport quarry. Then, in the spring of 1892, he signed aboard a fishing vessel as a deckhand. He was 16. The transition was noted by few. Dozens of boys made the same choice every year: quarry dust or salt spray, stone or sea. Both carried men away young. What distinguished Henley, according to those who worked with him, was an uncommon stillness. He was not gregarious, not given to the crude humor that filled the hours between ports. But he was reliable, steady-handed, the kind of man you wanted on your crew when the weather turned. Thomas Brennan hired him for the Margaret Rose in 1898. It was Brennan's first command, a 42-foot schooner he'd purchased with money saved over 20 years at sea. He needed experienced hands who wouldn't challenge his authority and wouldn't drink away their pay before the next voyage. Henley fit. The 2 men developed what those around them described as a functional respect. Brennan taught Henley navigation, let him take the wheel in calm waters, trusted him with maintenance work over the winter months when the vessel was in port. In a letter to his wife dated March 1902, Brennan wrote, "Arthur is as close to a right hand as I've found. Doesn't speak much, but when he does, it's worth hearing. The kind of quiet that comes from thinking, not from having nothing to say." The crew of the Margaret Rose remained relatively stable between 1898 and 1904. James Coughlin joined in 1899. Peter Anderson, the eldest, came aboard in 1900. bringing with him nearly 3 decades of experience and a reputation for reading weather better than any instrument. Daniel Kearney and Robert Ames signed on in 1901. Michael Brennan, Thomas's son, had worked summer voyages since he was 15, but joined as full crew only in 1904. It was meant to be a transition, his father teaching him the trade, preparing him to one day take command himself. Interviews with family members and fellow fishermen paint a picture of ordinary men engaged in dangerous ordinary work. They were not heroes, not villains. They were husbands and fathers and sons who went to sea because the sea was what they knew. What bound them was not friendship in the conventional sense, but the deeper trust required of men whose lives depend on one another's competence. On a vessel the size of the Margaret Rose, there was no room for ego or carelessness. You learned to read the smallest signs, a crewmate's posture, the tone of a command, the rhythm of work. You learned who would hold steady when the deck pitched, who would falter. By all accounts, Arthur Henley held steady. Sarah Kearney, Daniel's fiancée, was interviewed in 1906 by a journalist attempting to piece together the story. She described meeting Henley at a church social in July 1904, 2 months before the voyage. Daniel introduced us. Arthur shook my hand and said it was a pleasure. He didn't linger, didn't try to charm or impress. But Daniel spoke well of him afterward. Said Arthur was the kind of man you'd want beside you if something went wrong. He meant it as praise. She paused in the interview according to the journalist's notes, before adding, "I wonder now what Daniel knew, if he had a sense something might go wrong, or if that's just what you say about anyone you trust, that you'd want them there when things fall apart." The summer of 1904 was mild. The catch had been steady through June and July. The Margaret Rose returned from each voyage with holds full enough to keep the crew paid and the vessel maintained. There was no indication of tension aboard, no fights reported at the taverns where fishermen gathered, no debts that might drive a man to desperation. Robert Ames's widow, Catherine, would later say, "Robert kissed the children goodbye the morning of September 6th, same as he always did. He told me he'd bring back something special. He always said that. It was a game between us. Once he brought a sand dollar. Once, a piece of sea glass. I still have them. The vessel departed at dawn. Weather clear, wind favorable. Harbor records show no irregularities. Somewhere beyond the sight of land, in the days that followed, something happened that would render 6 men gone and 1 man silent. But on the morning of September 6th, as the Margaret Rose cleared the breakwater and turned east toward Georges Bank, there was no sign of what was coming. In the archives of the Gloucester Maritime Museum, there is a photograph taken in August 1904 at a fishermen's union meeting. 17 men stand in 2 rows outside the Union Hall. Thomas Brennan is in the back row, arms crossed, expression neutral. Beside him, slightly out of focus, is a younger man in a dark cap. The museum curator identified him as Arthur Henley, based on cross-referencing with other known photographs. He is the only person in the photograph not looking at the camera. The reconstruction of events relies on inference, physical evidence, and the few verifiable facts that survived Henley's silence. The Margaret Rose was sighted on September 8th by the schooner Albatross, approximately 40 nautical miles east-southeast of Gloucester, fishing the northern edge of Georges Bank. The Albatross captain, John Mercer, recorded the sighting in his log. Past Margaret Rose, mid-morning, all well. Good catch showing. The vessels were close enough to exchange waves, but did not come alongside for conversation. Standard practice when both crews were working. This sighting establishes that 2 days into the voyage, the Margaret Rose and her full crew of 7 were alive and actively fishing. Weather records from the United States Weather Bureau for September 6 through 16, 1904, show no major storms in the Georges Bank region. There were moderate winds on September 10th and 11, with seas running 4 to 6 feet, but nothing beyond the normal operating conditions for a vessel of the Margaret Rose's class. The ship's log, maintained by Thomas Brennan, continues through September 11th. The final entry reads, Position 41°67', winds SW light, seas calm, catch moderate. Weather holding fair. There is no entry for September 12th. The surveyor's report noted that the log showed no signs of water damage or disturbance. The handwriting did not deteriorate or show signs of haste. The final entry was as measured and routine as those that preceded it. Whatever happened began sometime after that entry was made. The medical examiner's analysis of Henley's injuries, the rope burns, the lacerations, the bruising, suggested sustained physical exertion over multiple days. The injuries were not consistent with a sudden catastrophic event. They were consistent with prolonged effort, gripping, pulling, holding on. The removal of the compass from its mounting remains unexplained. Marine experts consulted during the 1904 inquiry testified that there was no standard maritime practice that would require dismounting the compass and storing it below deck. Some speculated that it had been damaged and removed for repair, but examination showed the instrument to be in perfect working order. One surveyor offered a different theory in a marginal note on his report. Compass removed deliberately. Query, navigation no longer required or no longer trusted. The note was not included in the official findings. Among Henley's possessions recovered from his boarding house was a small notebook, water-stained and largely illegible. The few readable passages were mundane: notes on tidal patterns, sketches of knot configurations, a partial list of supplies needed for vessel maintenance. On the final page, in handwriting that graphologists later confirmed as Henley's, were 3 words: "Trust the wheel." No context, no explanation. The forensic analysis of the Margaret Rose identified one additional detail that did not appear in the public inquiry records, but was preserved in the private notes of Captain Vinson. In the forward storage locker, beneath coils of spare line, surveyors found a leather work glove. It was identified by monogramming as belonging to Peter Anderson. The glove had been placed there carefully, folded, not discarded, and beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small wooden box containing Anderson's pipe, tobacco pouch, and a tin-type photograph of a woman presumed to be his late wife. These were personal effects a man would not willingly leave behind, unless he had time to put them somewhere he believed they might be found. Captain Vinson wrote in his notes, "Items suggest preparation, not panic, not accident, deliberate arrangement of possessions, as though Anderson knew he would not return for them and wanted them preserved." He underlined the final sentence twice. Interviews with families revealed that several of the men had left similar markers. Michael Brennan had written a letter to his mother the night before departure, unusual for him. The letter was affectionate but unremarkable except for a single line: "I'm glad to be going with Pa and Arthur. Good men to learn from." Daniel Kearney had given Sarah an envelope before leaving, telling her to open it on their wedding day. After his disappearance, she opened it. Inside was a brief note expressing his love and a pressed flower. Nothing unusual, except that he had never before been sentimental in that way. Robert Ames had repaired a broken fence post in his yard the day before departure, a task he'd been putting off for weeks. His widow recalled, "I asked why he was suddenly so concerned about it. He said he didn't want to leave things undone. These may have been coincidences. Men often tidy their affairs before a voyage, consciously or not, aware of the sea's indifference. But taken together, they suggest a possibility, that the men of the Margaret Rose had some awareness, however vague, that this voyage might be different." The last confirmed position of the Margaret Rose with all hands aboard was September 11th, approximately 60 miles east of Gloucester, in waters well known to every man on that crew. Between September 11th and September 17th, the vessel moved. The position where Henley brought her into port was consistent with a slow, deliberate navigation westward, not the erratic drift of an abandoned ship, not the desperate flight from danger, a controlled return. One man alone, sailing a vessel designed for 7, navigating by what means we do not know. The compass was stored below, remember, bringing the Margaret Rose back to harbor. The harbormaster testified that when he boarded, Henley was not at the compass. He was steering by sight and feel, using landmarks along the coast. I asked him how long he'd been at the wheel. The harbormaster said. He looked at me and said, "Since it mattered." What happened in those 6 days? The physical evidence suggests no violence, No blood below deck, no signs of struggle. The vessel intact, seaworthy, her nets and equipment undamaged. 6 men gone. 1 man returned, and in the space between those facts, a silence vast enough to swallow every question. The inquiry ended, but the pressure did not. For 3 weeks following his release, Arthur Henley remained in Gloucester, moving between boarding houses, never staying more than 2 nights in one place. Landlords later reported that he paid in advance, kept to himself, and left no trace of his presence beyond rumpled bedding and, in one case, a window left open to the night air despite the cold. He did not seek employment, did not visit the harbour, did not attend church, though he had been a semi-regular presence at St. Anne's before the voyage. What he did, according to multiple witnesses, was walk. A shopkeeper on Main Street reported seeing him pass the same corner 4 times in a single afternoon, always heading in the same direction, always alone. A dock worker encountered him at 2 in the morning standing at the end of Long Wharf, staring out at the dark water. I asked if he was all right. The dock worker said in testimony to a later investigation. He turned and looked at me like he was surprised anyone could see him. Then he nodded and walked away. The families of the missing men occupied a different kind of limbo. Without bodies, there could be no funerals. Without funerals, no closure. The sea had taken their men, but the sea had given back no proof of death, only absence, and one living witness who would not speak. Margaret Brennan petitioned the court to have her husband declared legally dead so she might claim a widow's pension. The process required testimony. She asked Henley to provide it. He came to her home on October 12, 1904. The meeting was documented in a letter Mrs. Brennan wrote to her sister in New Hampshire, preserved in family papers donated to the Cape Ann Museum in 1967. Arthur arrived at 4 o'clock. He removed his cap at the door. I offered him tea. He declined. I asked him to sit. He remained standing. I told him I needed his statement for the court, that without it, I couldn't provide for the children. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I'll sign whatever you need." I had prepared a document with the help of Mr. Parsons, the lawyer. It stated simply that Thomas Brennan was lost at sea on or about September 12, 1904, and that Arthur Henley was witness to the circumstances. All he had to do was sign. He read it twice. Then he looked at me and said, "I can't swear to the date." I asked what date he could swear to. He said, "I can swear he's gone. I can't swear to when." I asked him why. He didn't answer. I asked him again, more forcefully. He set the paper on the table and said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Brennan. I'm so deeply sorry, but I can't." Then he left. The document was eventually signed by Captain Vinson based on the evidence of the inquiry. Margaret Brennan received her pension, but she never forgave Henley. In 1918, during the influenza epidemic, she contracted the illness and, in her delirium, spoke repeatedly of the man who wouldn't tell. Her daughter, Mary Brennan Callahan, later recounted that her mother's final coherent words were, "He knows. God forgive him, he knows." Other families attempted different approaches. James Coughlin's brother, a lawyer, threatened legal action, though on what grounds was never clear. The threat went nowhere. Catherine Ames brought her 2 children to the boarding house where Henley was staying in mid-October. She waited in the parlor until he came downstairs. She did not speak. She simply stood there with her children, a girl of 6 and a boy of 4, and waited. The landlord described the scene. Mr. Henley stopped on the stairs when he saw them. Mrs. Ames didn't say a word, just stood there with those children. Henley looked at them for a long time. The little boy asked his mother, "Is that the man who knows where Papa is?" Mrs. Ames shushed him. Henley went white. He came down the rest of the stairs very slowly. He knelt in front of those children. I remember that clearly. He knelt, and he looked at them like he was trying to memorize their faces. Then he stood and said to Mrs. Ames, "Your husband was a good man, a very good man. That's all." She waited to see if he'd say more. He didn't. She took her children and left. Henley went back upstairs. I heard him packing. He was gone by morning. The local newspaper, the Gloucester Daily Times, published an editorial on October 18, 1904, titled, "The Silence of the Survivor." The piece was restrained by the standards of the era, but clear in its implication. That Mr. Henley endured some manner of ordeal is not in question. That he suffers still is evident to any who have seen him. But suffering does not absolve a man of his duty to the living. 6 families mourn without the comfort of certainty. 6 widows and fatherless children deserve more than silence. The sea keeps many secrets. Must Mr. Henley keep them as well? The editorial prompted 3 letters to the editor. 2 supported the newspaper's position. The third, unsigned, read simply, "Some silences are not kept by choice. Some are kept because speech would do greater harm. Consider that before you judge." Handwriting experts later analyzed the letter and concluded it was not written by Henley. By late October, Henley had left Gloucester. The trail grows diffuse. A man matching his description worked briefly at a lumber camp in northern Maine in the winter of 1904-1905. The camp foreman recalled him as competent but solitary and noted that he refused to work near the river where logs were floated downstream. Said he'd had enough of water, the foreman reported. In the spring of 1905, a bank clerk in Portland, Maine, recorded a transaction with an Arthur Henley, deposit of $60, savings account opened and closed the same day, funds withdrawn in cash. The clerk remembered because Henley asked if the bank kept records of transactions. When told they did, he withdrew the money and did not return. There are gaps of months, sometimes years. In 1908, a parish priest in Burlington, Vermont, wrote in his diary about a man who attended Mass every morning for 2 weeks, always sitting in the last pew, never taking communion. I approached him on the final day to welcome him. He thanked me and said he'd found what he needed. I asked what that was. He said, "A place where no one asks questions." I never saw him again. The most substantive record comes from 1912. A hospital in Plattsburgh, New York, admitted a man named Arthur Henley for treatment of pneumonia. The attending physician, Dr. Leonard Morrison, kept detailed notes. Patient recovered adequately, but showed signs of significant psychological distress. Nightmares reported by night staff. Violent thrashing, calling out, though words were indistinct. On the 4th day of his stay, I asked if there was anyone I should contact on his behalf. He said, there was no one. I remarked that everyone has someone. He replied, I did once. I asked what happened to them. He looked at me for a long moment and said, I couldn't keep them. The phrasing struck me as odd. Not I lost them, or they died, but I couldn't keep them, as though he had been given charge of something precious and failed. Dr. Morrison's notes conclude, patient discharged October 3, 1912, against medical advice. Left forwarding address as General Delivery, Plattsburgh, but never collected mail. I have often wondered what burden that man carried. It was visible in his posture, in the way he held himself apart from the world, as though he believed he had no right to its comfort. The final confirmed sighting came in 1916. A railway conductor on the Boston and Maine line reported a passenger who boarded in Portland and rode to Boston, then immediately purchased a return ticket without leaving the station. The conductor remembered because the man sat by the window the entire journey, watching the coastline. I asked if he'd forgotten something in Portland. He said no. I asked why he'd come all this way just to go back. He said, I wanted to see if I could. When we passed Gloucester, he stood and looked out the window for a long time. His hand was pressed against the glass. I thought he might get off there, but he sat back down. When we reached Portland again, he thanked me for the ride. I asked his name. He hesitated, then said, it doesn't matter much anymore. After 1916, Arthur Henley disappears from the record entirely. In 1952, a graduate student in maritime history at Boston University, Claire Osgood, undertook a thesis project examining unsolved disappearances in the New England fishing industry between 1880 and 1920. The case of the Margaret Rose represented one of 14 incidents she investigated. Osgood was granted access to the Vinson inquiry transcripts, which had been sealed for 45 years under a provision allowing for delayed public access to sensitive maritime investigations. She also conducted interviews with surviving family members, though by 1952, nearly all direct witnesses had died. Her thesis, Silence and the Sea, Reconstructing Loss in the Gloucester Fisheries, devotes 40 pages to the Margaret Rose. Her conclusion is cautious but pointed. What is most striking about the Henley case is not what he refused to say, but what his silence protected. The physical evidence contradicts every obvious explanation: storm, accident, violence. What remains is the possibility that Henley's silence was not an act of cowardice or guilt, but of mercy, that he understood something about what happened that would have been unbearable for the families to know, and that he chose to carry that burden alone rather than distribute it among those already grieving. Osgood interviewed Mary Brennan Callahan, daughter of Thomas Brennan, in 1951. Mrs. Callahan was 66 years old, living in Rockport, a widow herself by then. I asked her if she still thought about Arthur Henley, Osgood wrote. She said she thought about him often. I asked if she hated him for not speaking. She said she had for a long time, but she'd come to believe that whatever he was protecting us from was worse than not knowing. She said, "My father trusted him. That meant something. If Arthur thought silence was the kindest thing, I have to believe my father would have understood." The archives yield other fragments. In 1937, a man donated a rosary to St. Anne's Church in Gloucester, with a note requesting it be kept in memory of Peter Anderson. The rosary matched the description of the one found in Henley's hammock aboard the Margaret Rose. The donor's name was illegible, and the priest who accepted the donation had died by the time researchers attempted to trace it. In 1943, a veterans' hospital in Albany, New York, recorded the death of an Arthur Henley, age approximately 67, cause listed as heart failure. No next of kin, no service, buried in a county cemetery under a simple marker. The birth year would have made him the right age. The grave has never been verified as belonging to the Arthur Henley of the Margaret Rose, but researchers have noted that Albany is inland, far from the sea, in a region where no one would have known his name or his history, a place where no one would ask questions. In 2003, the Cape Ann Museum mounted an exhibition titled "Lost at Sea: The Gloucester Fishing Tragedies." The Margaret Rose was included. Among the materials on display was a single photograph, discovered in the estate papers of Margaret Brennan, a candid shot taken aboard the Margaret Rose in the summer of 1903. The crew is visible on deck, hauling nets. Thomas Brennan stands near the mast. In the background, barely visible, is a younger man coiling line. The museum curator noted in the exhibition catalogue, "This is the only known photograph of Arthur Henley and the crew of the Margaret Rose together." What's striking is how ordinary it appears. These are men at work. Nothing in the image suggests what they would face a year later. Nothing suggests that only one of them would return. Beneath the photograph, the curator included a quote from Henley's testimony to Captain Vinson. It is one of the few longer responses he gave, when asked directly if he felt responsible for what happened. Henley's answer: "Responsibility requires choice. I don't know if I had one. The families of the lost men are gone now." The Margaret Rose was sold at auction in 1905 and operated under different ownership until 1921, when it was decommissioned and broken up for salvage. The compass, the one removed from its mounting and stored below, was purchased by a collector and eventually donated to the Peabody Essex Museum, where it remains in storage, tagged only with its catalogue number and the note. Origin: Margaret Rose, 1904. Context unknown. What happened aboard that vessel in September 1904 is, in the absence of Henley's testimony, a matter of pure speculation. Researchers have proposed theories ranging from mass hysteria to carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty stove. Some have suggested mutiny, though there is no evidence of conflict. Others have theorized a rogue wave, though the weather records don't support it. Each theory collapses under scrutiny. What remains is the image of one man at the wheel of a vessel meant for seven, navigating home by instinct and will, carrying a secret he would not share, even when silence cost him everything. In her thesis, Claire Osgood wrote, "We assume silence is a wall, but sometimes it is a container, something built to hold what cannot be released." Henley's silence was not empty, it was full, and what it held, he believed, was not his to give away. The historian's task is to reconstruct the past from evidence, to build narratives that explain what happened and why. But some pasts resist reconstruction. Some stories end not with revelation, but with the acknowledgement that some truths were meant to stay buried, not because they are shameful, but because they are unendurable. Arthur Henley returned from the sea, but what returned with him? What he carried in the years that followed, in the boarding houses and lumber camps and railway cars, in the hospitals and churches, and finally, perhaps, in that quiet grave far from salt water, that we will never know. 6 families waited for answers that never came. One man carried a burden he would not set down, and the sea, as always, kept its secrets. The file on the Margaret Rose remains open in the archives of the Coast Guard, technically unsolved, though no active investigation has been pursued since 1906. On the final page of Captain Vinson's private notes, there is a sentence he wrote after the inquiry concluded. It was never included in any official report. I believe Henley knows exactly what happened. I also believe he is right not to tell us. No explanation follows, just that statement, and then the file goes silent.